As a child, when we visited St. Croix, the Bahamas, or Jamaica, we stayed with not quite family, but very, very close friends, almost like family. I don't recall being jealous that my classmates, if they went to those places, stayed at hotels with pools and beaches. After yesterday, I might feel differently. uh, and growing up in New York City, early on, I think most importantly, and I dropped this in here knowing that I don't have an image that's going to correspond later, which was in my head, but see, I've been director now for a year and a half, and I don't think curatorially very well anymore. Thankfully, I get to work with such an incredible team. I knew that CONCACAF was the Association of North Central American and Caribbean Football, and half of my team was from the latter region. It's cliche to say it, but Holly mentioned this exhibition in my bio, Football, the Beautiful Game. But truly that, Camus said everything he learned about life he learned from football. I feel like everything I learned about curating I learned from football. Growing up in New York in the 1970s, surrounded by the New York Cosmos, who had Giorgio Chinaglia. Of course, all of these people were at the end of their career. Giorgio Chinaglia, Carlos Alberto, Johan Cruyff was there for a moment, on and on. Franz Beckenbauer, and of course, the greatest ever, Pelé. And so being in that environment, and like always being in that environment and going to Pelé soccer camp, and it was this sense of a game not only as art, but as people, and learning about each other. So I grew up, and I also grew up around some art. Not Lorraine's art, and this is Lorraine O'Grady. This is Mademoiselle Bourgeoise Noire, a piece that she created in 1980 and first performed, I believe it was 81, at the New Museum, where she walks into what is an opening of an exhibition that Marcia Tucker had organized. And she proceeded to, you can't really see it here, but some of you have seen this piece before. She has this cat o' nine tails, and she's walking through the crowd, admonishing people to talk about issues and to talk about art that does something. And the thing that I love about Lorraine, or one of the things I love about Lorraine in this piece, is that she had this kind of dual purpose. Like, on one hand, she was talking to downtown New York and saying that your view is a little myopic. You're not really seeing the big picture of what is being created at this time in New York City, the early 1980s. On the other hand, she had this relationship that I shared, probably a little bit, to the work of some of her contemporaries who were making abstract paintings, and she was prickly about that relationship, just as prickly about that relationship as she was about the downtown scene, and wanting that work to do something different. She believed that, it was very much about a sort of institutional gallery type of work that she really demanded. We need something different. We need something more. So that was why that image is up there. So yes, as I was saying, grew up around a little bit of art, not the Lorraine type of in-your-face conceptual performative, but primarily art that was made by black people. So I think it surely had some roots in the Caribbean. I remember Romare Bearden talking about Martinique, or at least I remember my father talking about Martinique and Romare Bearden's art. The Studio Museum in Harlem was down the street, and I can't really remember going there, but just that it was there and was important for existing and was a place that certain people regularly convened. I associated it with a lot of abstract art that I had seen by the likes of Joe Overstreet, Ed Clark, Bill Hudson, and Al Loving, among others. And I would say that finding Lorraine much later, but finding Jean-Michel Basquiat in the mid-'80s was like a revelation that the present did clearly exist in visual art, and that it might have something to do with other cultural forms. Let's move. And so I'm just going to just put that up for a second, just that pause around thinking about somebody who was clearly doing something different. And I really believe that Lorraine and Jean-Michel Basquiat, when he first started out, were very much on the same plane. She put him in an exhibition in 1983, an exhibition called The Black and White Show, which was similarly for her about, I think, what that performance was about in trying to test boundaries. So of course, we see this image here. This is like 1978, first recognition for Basquiat, who at that point is only 18 years old, but is becoming known for doing this SAMO tags on the streets. You see a little bit of that there, and you see the performative aspect, the fact that it is about other cultural forms and not just about painting, which of course is not what the world and the New York Times is going to tell us it is right now, right? Because yesterday, La Hara, a painting of a policeman, sold for $35 million. And the Sotheby's painting that's coming up next, which is a skull, and I think tellingly, neither one of these paintings have any text in them, right? So they're not, like they're mixing it up, and the policeman image is definitely mixing it up, but they're also images that are a little bit diffused as far as what his work does. And we'll see a couple of images of some pieces that are quite in opposition to that. But so I'm thinking about him this morning because of, these things, and so you get these calls every now and then as they come about. But of course, we're talking about this artist who, born and raised in Brooklyn, father Haitian, mother Puerto Rican, and much has been made, I think, of that conversation, especially for us in Miami. And of course, we had the traveling exhibition from the Brooklyn Museum just last year, which was a way, I think, of positing the work in a space that was different from Brooklyn, but also a space that was more receptive than other places have been in the past to some of the cultural lineage and some of the aspects of his work that really play out in a city where you have Edwidge Danticat, for instance, writing about him just a neighborhood away, or you have murals of him on the middle of the major 54th Street in Miami. So there's this context that was different, and as somebody who has been looking at this work for a very long time, it was incredibly illuminating to see it in that context. Later, as an intern and an employee at Studio Museum, I was there at the same time as shows like the Decade Show, which was like The Other Story, Afro-Asian Artists in Post-War Britain, 1989 by Rashid Araeen. And also at the same time as Wilfredo Lam and his contemporaries, and at the same time that Nari Ward, who we mentioned, was in residence at Studio. So, it was just there. It was the lay of the land. And I knew there was something a tiny bit more radical in calling The Other Story Afro-Asian artists, but didn't understand how radical at that time. And it was about drawing a collective, about creating, just like we are here, about creating and staking out a claim to space and collective thought that might actually be helpful in life. And we still struggle so mightily to do this, and it's a little bit annoying. Thanks to Moray Bisham-Bird, I was later given the opportunity to co-edit the catalog Transforming the Crown, African, Asian, and Caribbean Artists in Britain, 1966 to 1996, published by the Caribbean Cultural Center / African Diaspora Institute, and distributed by the University of Chicago Press. The essays in that book included Moray's London Bridge, late 20th century British art, and the roots of national culture, Anne Walmsley's History of the Relationship in London between West Indian Literary and Pictorial Arts, the Caribbean Arts Movement, 1966 to 1972. a space and a voice for visual practice. Coben and Mercer's Bodies of Diaspora, Vessels of Desire, the erotic and the aesthetic. Chilean Tawadros, Running with the Hare and Hunting with the Hounds. Deborah Willis, Talking Back, Black Women's Visual Liberation Through Photography. Judith Wilson's Surfacing the Black Diaspora Web, Post-Colonial British Art and the Decolonization of U.S. Visual Culture. Okwe Enwezer's A Question of Place, Revisions, Reassessments, Diaspora. And of course, the great Eddie Chambers, The Emergence of the Black British Artist. Wow. So this was after undergrad, and so you get to work on a project like that, and you say, okay, I'm not going to grad school. The experience was like a crash course in a whole other realm of thought. Friendships and working relationships were established that last to this day, and curatorial relationships with artists. I still had years ahead of me to grapple with those authors, and also, of course, Paul Gilroy and Stuart Hall, but they became a part of every thought that I dared ponder in regard to any curatorial proposal. In the catalog of Wrestling with the Image, Trinidadian artist Christopher Cozier writes, "The Caribbean artist is always in competition with a long history of expedient labeling of their world and their very selves, externally and also internally. In other words, how can there be artists in a place of no art? Thinking about Caribbean art then requires a broadening of the art frame, historiographically and structurally." And thanks to Diana Nawi for pointing me in the direction of the inaugural Tilting Axis Curatorial Fellow, Nicole Smith-Johnson's brilliant essay, Curating Beyond the Exhibition, reflecting on 3 weeks in Scotland, where the above paragraph comes from. I didn't come from the art frame that Cozier describes, which is the world where, as Smith-Johnson and Erica James as well have taken to task, where there is a sixth biennial of the Caribbean in St. Kitts that exists without art, as if the region were bereft of visual art, vernacular or otherwise. No, because our art world was informed by artists known by only one name, like Tanner, Douglas, Hayden, Savage, Vanderzee, Bearden, Lawrence, Catlett, and Thompson, just to name some. When I was in college and studying Afro-American art since 1850, the professor was an Africanist, and the class began with the Caribbean Day Parade in Brooklyn. So yet again, perhaps a simplistic, but maybe an effective way of talking lenses and frames of reference in regard to curating and the art of the Caribbean, but one that puts it closer to the center than the frame of reference of many. The exhibition Neo Hoodoo was an effort to make sense of this particular space to some degree. What do we call it? I'm not sure, and I feel unsure even in how we talk this morning in reference to this space in between the two sides of the Atlantic. This exhibition was very much about that, perhaps in recognition of the fact that times had changed since The Other Story and Transforming the Crown, and that there was an examination of the American artistic space around spirituality that was important in light of the way we discuss contemporary art in the United States. So Neo Hoodoo was this idea that was formed in conversation with many other people at PS1 in New York, but didn't open until I had moved from New York to Houston, and so it changed a lot. And so instead of ending up with probably what would have been like Brian Youngin or William Cordova in the front as you come into the space, if it were at PS1, you ended up with James Lee Byers, his halo being at the center of the opening at Houston at the Manil Collection. And it was to suggest this sort of widening of the frame, right? Because moving from New York, wanting to do an exhibition that talked about spirituality in an American sense that decidedly made a rule that all of the artists were from the quote-unquote Americas and not dealing with that other side of the Atlantic. But moving to a place where there was a Mark Rothko chapel down the hall and that these pieces, like this halo, were immediately there, sort of morphed the exhibition. The subtitle comes from Ishmael Reed directly because, as in almost any exhibitions that I've thought of, there's always a literary jump-off. And for me, the literary jump-off for this exhibition was his book Mumbo Jumbo. And I'm sure many of you have read it, but one of, I think, the central thesis and one of the things that we all grapple with in our work is, who owns what and how do we present that work in many ways. And so in the book, the driving plot is this group of guys who are, I think, acting curatorially, and they are trying to rescue the objects from the House of Art detention, right? And the House of Art detention, of course, is at 82nd Street and 5th Avenue in New York. So the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which has stolen all the booty, and the whole job is to get that work out of there, to put it back into some sort of context that is more where it's coming from. So he came up with this subtitle. And just a couple of images. Nari Ward, Liquor Soul on the right, which is actually facing off, and sorry for the image, it's a long time ago, facing off with a cooler on the floor that is made by Brian Jungian, the Vancouver artist, and carved into the cooler are these signs and symbols of the vernacular art of the Northwest. Also, what's propping up the top of that cooler are tall boys of Budweiser, which he was trying to give back liquor. And so it was interesting to have across from Nari's Liquor Soul sculpture, which came from a conversation that he was having around found objects and their significance, I think, to the neighborhood he lived in Harlem. And then on the floor, Marepi's halo. The Buyers, a couple of works by Cacho, and you can sort of make out in the center a Brian Jungian totem, and Michael Tracy, Texas artist. And Gary Simmons dealing with the vernacular and the idea of a transmission of cultural ritual and form that he's taking from the bottle trees that are associated with the American Southeast, which have reference points back in West Africa, and then Robert Gober in the front, and of course to suggest some level of performance, without it being performance, Felix Gonzalez Torres's Go-Go. And then Jose Badia, Jean-Michel Basquiat, who has been a constant in several exhibitions. And you can see the Badia there, and also Janine Antoni next to the Brian Jungian, and Jimmy Durham on paper in the background, and a work on the right by Sanford Biggers. And so now to Prospect. I'm especially grateful to Holly for putting ARC Magazine's lens on the Prospect Biennial in 2014, which helped me think about its context for today. I learned so much in that piece, and really just overwhelmingly felt like, somebody got it, every single aspect. This is amazing. So I'm still like, I'm happy to return today to the context of speaking a little bit about this exhibition. Prospect was an amalgamation, I think, of every show I did before that. And in retrospect, it's easy for me now to believe that I knew I was not going to be a curator immediately after that. and that there was another job coming, and so that in a sense, like it sounds cliche now, but last show, it feels very much like that. Not last, but I'm certain it will never. I will never ever put that much energy into an exhibition again, neither intellectually nor physically. For that exhibition, which also comes from that Neo-Hoodoo conversation, which comes from some of those other early experiences, was this idea of framing and this idea of trying to see each other through the frames of reference that we use in exhibitions and through art. I'm pleased. Aside from, I think, well, let me get stuck into this. So, Prospect, the idea of doing one of these type of biennial shows was something that I actually had been thinking about deeply for the preceding, back to 1997. I wrote a piece in 1997 in Flash Art that was about 97 as a pivotal year for these type of exhibitions. I think I was already engaged in this conversation with Unji by then. And these type of exhibitions, meaning, 97, like 2017, the year when you have Venice Biennial, you have Sculpture Project and Moonstir, you have Documenta, all in that same period. But 97 was also I think it was the second Johannesburg Biennial. It was probably like the fourth or fifth Istanbul. Harold Zeman was doing Gwangju, and I believe it was the second. So there was this confluence of different places that were entering into this conversation, and sometimes I'm still surprised that we published this. The title of the essay was "The Unbearable Lightness of Whiteness." And I'm still thinking it's because I'm the only one in the office that actually speaks English native tongue, right? Because I was in Milan working for Flash Art, and so that didn't make sense. But so this conversation on this type of exhibition went back to that period, and being able to have that one-on-one experience with those exhibitions at that time was a big part of thinking about Prospect. And one of the things that I thought was important was that it must relate to the space within where it is. It must have some sort of overarching relationship to that space. And so what I tried to do was think, again, through literature, stumbling across this little book called The Moviegoer by Walker Percy, and stumbling across it in the span of a studio visit, right? Because all of I think, so much what drives the conversation for all of us in terms of curating is just being in the studio with artists. And that was kind of like the second underpinning, must relate to where it is and must come out of present conversations with artists. Somebody told me to read this little book, and it became this kind of like a really compact way of getting to those two ideas. The whole book is set in New Orleans at a time like just early civil rights movement kind of time in a city that at that time is all about segregation and all about not seeing each other, like literally like just not understanding at all what one could be thinking of if they look different from you. And there was one really telling, I think, scene very early in the book where the main character, this guy, Binks Bowling, who's on his the search, is contemplating at the dinner table how the butler who's black, like he has absolutely no idea about anything about his life, although the guy's been living in his house or coming in and out of his house for 30-something years. So it was all about this idea of how do we see each other, and that being a part of the search. And so it located it specifically in that space. And the book came out at the same time as these celebrated authors or celebrated books. Revolutionary Road, of course, at that time being made into a big movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and J.D. Salinger, of course, and Joseph Heller's Catch-22. So it was a small book, and like Percy, I mean, as somebody actually studied American literature, still didn't know the work very well, but that he won the National Book Award for 1962 and beating out these other probably much better known authors. Sorry. But the real interesting book in context would be The Fire Next Time, which comes out the following year, 1963. And thinking about how this exhibition in this very American yet not American of cities could possibly have something to do with this conversation from so many years prior. And I think Baldwin was more of a spiritual place to have that conversation. I don't know why. Okay. Here, actually. Yeah, sure. Okay. So we're just going to see a little bit of this incredible. Okay. This piece by the Propeller Group, we're getting a little. It's okay. You get the gist. Many of you have seen this piece. But the important thing, and I throw this in there now, is that idea of being in the present, and that idea of the exhibition as this place of discourse for the quote-unquote other, not in the other sense of I think a more cultural criticism way, but this idea of seeing each other. And this work in particular was one of only about a dozen of 50-something artists that was created with the exhibition in mind. And so it was a two-part piece, and it's not only the video which is showing this fictionalized account of a funeral in Vietnam that looks a lot like it could be in New Orleans, and to its relationship of second lines and of mourning as performative ritual. So that was a very important aspect to get in there. But yet there was also this kind of desire, because it's going to be the last show you ever do, there's this desire to speak, art historically and not only within the moment. And so to think back to these artists. And the thing that was interesting, the other hard part about the exhibition, which made it at least difficult for me, was the fact that you're making work, as we all do, in very, very different spaces at the same time. So with the opportunity to have a space like the New Orleans Museum of Art, which is a museum that's been around since the early 1930s, and has a collection and has a relationship to ideas of what our encyclopedic institutions are supposed to be, filled with a lot of European painting and sculpture, that you had to sort of play with that idea or that relationship as well, while the piece by the Propeller Group could function in a completely different space on its own in a neighborhood that was nothing like the neighborhood where the museum was. But with that opportunity to think about, go again, of course I did not get this painting, right? It goes to the point, and this idea of who are we, what are we, where are we going, comes from the title of the painting, was the central aspect of trying to look back art historically, but then also to recognize the fact that we were in New Orleans and not in Europe and not in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific, but a place that has these linkages to where we are today. Thus, the work of Tarsila do Amaral was kind of like a counterpoint to that idea. And of course, with Tarsila's work, bringing forward the idea of what happens in another context when we speak of the other and her relationship to anthropophagia and the idea of we eat the other, we take the best and make it our own. So I could see it, and in some ways, we put that conversation forward as the oldest work in the exhibition, and it provided some sort of, I think, an art historical framework from which to move forward with this conversation of how we see each other that goes obviously way further back than that book and certainly the present issues, but takes us back a ways. As you walked into the New Orleans Museum of Art, the walls were ringed by the work of Fred Brown, somebody who had a very specific relationship to music and to that space, who had done a large exhibition in New Orleans before he passed early. Jeffrey Gibson, another one of a younger artist in the exhibition, using material that had a sort of different play within the space of New Orleans Museum, where they had an encyclopedic collection of Native American art, and his work sort of playing with what are the stereotypical ideas of Native American art. Jeffrey's research also was interesting in light of being in New Orleans Museum and being, in that institutional place that begins in the 30s, and thinking about what the history is like for museums in an American context, where my beacon was kind of the Alfred Barr thing and Museum of Modern Art, and thinking back to some of those early exhibitions in the 30s, right? So there was a Native American exhibition in 1935 at MoMA. There was the exhibition of Cuban art very early on. There was an exhibition of Negro art very early on. And all of these things were kind of, before World War II, always driving towards this approach that was way more anthropological based and way more about art being used as this tool to learn about each other, as opposed to the avant-garde model that comes after. And I think in 1955, to think about those exhibitions, by the time you get to 1955, you do a show like Family of Man to say, oh, right, we left that stuff behind, but now we're going to do it for a moment just to reconsider. I'm going to go a little bit faster. Ed Clark was born in New Orleans in 1926. Ed Clark on the left, Joe Mitchell, of course, on the right. They were very close friends. And so while wanting to have this conversation that's very much driven by representational imagery, also wanting to partake in another conversation. And of course, being in a place like that with the idea of music, with the idea of improvisation being so incredibly central that it could be addressed through the work of someone like an Ed Clark, who's still, of course, alive now and having exhibitions. Huguette Caron, widening the frame. And then Basquiat being obviously a central part of the exhibition there and of New Orleans period. And looking at work that is, let's see, very much in conversation with different aspects of that place. Music, Zydeco, the music of Louisiana itself, Eshu, ideas around spirituality, idea of the meeting of different forms of religion or spirituality as was more looked at in the Neo-Hoodoo exhibition, but obviously a painting like that really brings that conversation forward. And then the King Zulu, I mean, the fact that he's painted this figure and he had this fascination with the city, actually traveled there the year that he passed, that he would paint this King Zulu, which is this painting of Louis Armstrong at its center, and it commemorates Armstrong in blackface because that he was the leader of the Zulu parade in the 30s or early 40s in New Orleans. And so there's this very, very specific reference point while the conversation is obviously much wider in scope. Flash of the Spirit being central to the conversation for him, and also I think central to obviously the conversation that we have between the Atlantic. Basquiat owned work by Sam Doyle. This idea of self-taught art was also something that played a minor role within the exhibition, but obviously had to play a role because this work was shown at the Ogden Museum, a place that is very well known for having a very large collection of self-taught art, primarily from the American Southeast. Doyle was in the collection of Basquiat. And this is the painting that we wanted, that would have been your central image for the exhibition. It's obviously Undiscovered Genius of the Mississippi Delta, but it had been bought at Sotheby's like 2 weeks before, and we talked back and forth, and in the end, the collector decided, nah, you can't have the painting. And that was again annoying because it brings forward, this conversation with him is not unique, but it's interesting in light of the fact that museums were not there early on, right? So the Whitney has one very good painting. MoMA's had something up recently, but I think it's on loan. They're really, the best work is all in private collections, and they've all more or less been trading hands between the same 15 people. So new collector, but still doesn't want to, let go of the painting. Direct references to the river that runs through New Orleans. Direct references to American literature, histories. And the same, El Grande Espectaculo, collection of Valentino, couldn't get it out of the building in New York. Another very big triptych painting. These are not the kind of paintings you see coming to auction. This is not the $60 million Basquiat that's coming up for auction, right? History, all about critical conversations around history. But Zydeco, that turned out to be the centerpiece thanks to Bruno Bischofberger. And further to the conversation within this space was a conversation around incarceration through two artists that live and work in New Orleans and have been photographing in Louisiana, in the prison, going back more than 20 years. And also artists who were active about that participation and active about the work to the point where they were involved with a freedom project and working with lawyers to get people who had been wrongly imprisoned to get them out. And so it was an important aspect also in the same space as the Basquiat work. One of the things that I was struck by in the 2 years running up to the exhibition and having spent time also in Mississippi was the fact that you have these huge prisons, right? Angola and Louisiana, and then Parchment in Mississippi. And it's basically, it's the whole modern day slavery thing. They're making things making products that go into consumer society, although while imprisoned. It's amazing that and chilling to drive by these places. Hubert Singleton, part of that conversation on self-taught art in the context of the Ogden. Lucia Koch, because everything, I think it was that show, right? You got to put everything in there. So in order to get into the Contemporary Art Center space, it was all about color. It was just all about having a relationship to variations of color and making use of these incredible windows. Theaster Gates' works, some of his tar paintings, and then also, of course, a big fire hose tapestry. Yunfei Ji did a piece in this rotunda circle. He had already spent time in New Orleans and was relating this kind of storyline, this narrative that was actually about a village in China that had dealt with natural disaster. And so he was using that as a counterpoint. Analia Saban, artist who made work out of whatever refuse there was in this building, this old warehouse building, and she was actually making paintings and sculptures out of that material. David Zinke, another important video within the exhibition, a piece that he made with musicians in Cuba that was all about a sort of call and response and this idea of communication without words. MacArthur Binion, Douglas Bourgeois, we just got a painting. Sophie Lovov. Okay, just a quick.
Van saludando difunto en Fumbe, salam aleikum, aleikum salam. Para yo recuerde a mi sangre a Pungo, mi tabla para los que me llama.
Just to give you a sense, Glenn Kino working with coral. Lisa Siegel I just passed. Charles Gaines, a very difficult piece to show as a slide, is actually a light box installation that goes from dark to light and comes up upon these four pivotal texts that all deal with civil disobedience. A brilliant way of evoking, I think, the concrete knowledge of reading and of fact-based knowledge, along with his mix of the night sky. That's basically what it turns into when you look at it in the darkness. August Suage, Pushpamala, Peter Hugo, Mohammed Boroisa, Serena. You can keep going. Andrea Fraser, Ebony Patterson, who we're working on an exhibition with right now. Camille Monroe, William Cordova, another artist we're working on an exhibition with right now. You can pause on that, and I'll just try and finish up. But this Andrea Fraser work is another one of those site-specific pieces, and in this case, she, research-based for performance. She took the transcripts of the legal proceedings around the desegregation of carnival floats. And to believe that, I believe it was early 80s that this conversation was still being had in New Orleans on whether or not black people and white people could be on the same float. Imagine that. So, 90s? It was 90s, yeah. crazy. So she took on these different characters just using the transcript and performed the proceedings over the course of an hour. And we just did that twice during the exhibition. Gary Simmons, sound system, obviously important. And we could end there with Tavares Strawn, another artist that we all know and artist that we're working on an exhibition with right now. I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to take questions if you have any. I was going to talk about more Pam stuff too, but, we got it. And I mentioned some of those exhibitions that are upcoming and just want to reiterate our commitment. And then I was just thinking, aside from the best part of these convenings and hugs and all that stuff, is just being able to face-to-face with you guys. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. 91, the New Orleans Carnival Desegregation Ordinance. Franklin, and of course you are going to correct me if I misunderstood, but there is a distinct shift in your presentation of the work in Prospect, New Orleans, when you go from screening that snippet of the Propeller Group film as a work that I think you say can exist in the moment, and then you shift back and you say, but to go back to speak or think art historically, and then we're in the museum and we're around painting. That to me is a fundamentally problematic disconnect. To not be able to think art historically, or maybe more widely aesthetically, about the infrastructures that can house these performance-based work, which are so much at the core of what we, the Caribbean and African diasporic people, are about. Yeah. So I wanted you to tell us more about how, there was such a seizure in terms of your thinking curatorially between the works of the moment and the... Sorry.
No.
You can see, but my mind was like... Because it really struck me how the art historical discourse had, reverted back to the painting and the frame and
You're absolutely right.
The exhibition space.
Yeah, part of it is, I think there are two parts that come to mind. The part of it is just my own natural space of comfort in terms of curatorial is more, institutional in a way. Even though I was not within an institution for quite some time, it always has functioned that way. Even when it was about teaching, and teaching basically like 1895 to the present or something. It was about that kind of relationship to the institution. And so I also felt like I'm comfortable there, and also I was playing against the immediate history associated with the actual exhibition, because of course it was the third iteration. And so I was hyper aware of the fact that the first show attempted to really put work outside in a really, really concerted way, and not to have such an institutional relationship. So it seemed like an opportunity to swing back, and also being a place of comfort made it very easy to swing back. The second thing was, and I say honestly, not just because we have the beautiful poster over here and you here, is that I knew that there was an exhibition called En Masse coming up immediately after the exhibition in one of the same spaces. And so there was a level of performance that we had discussed that was also about the deep relationship to performance that city has. And especially to this space that we are in today, that I knew I didn't have to mess with too much. So those are the two kind of ways that I deal with that.
In a way, this is, I think, to me, a good framing of maybe the proceedings for the next couple of days, because I think that is really something that we're grappling with in terms of the infrastructure of the exhibitionary within the Caribbean and African diasporic spaces in general. So thank you.
Yeah,
thank
absolutely.
you so much. Wonderful.
We're grappling with that. And it's funny, I was just talking to someone just now. I mean, so that last Venice biennial, right? Oakley's Venice biennial. You cut the big square into the middle of the installation and say that it's all about performance, right? And it's kind of the same thing. That's what PAM is, too. We have this auditorium that is built directly into the center as if that is your central node. And I think that there are a lot of possibilities, obviously, for thinking in a different way in relationship to our curatorial spaces. Thanks, Claire.
Well, then please join me in saying a very sincere
Thank you. Thank you.